everyone, welcome back to another episode of Hong Kong Horror. Simon here. Let me ask you a question. Do any of you have family members that you just can't stand? Now, imagine being forced to live with them under the same roof, seeing them day in and day out. Tonight's story comes to us from a viewer who asked me to use an alias, so let's just call him Vincent. Vincent is a family man now in his late 40s, living out in California. But his story takes us back to his childhood in rural Thailand. At the time, his dad decided to take in a struggling aunt and uncle, but the real nightmare didn't start until his uncle found something on the side of a desolate road. It's a terrifying lesson on cursed objects and why some things are abandoned for a reason. So please stick around till after the story, because as always, I'm going to break it down from a Chinese cultural perspective to figure out exactly what happened here. Alright, let's turn on the lights, get comfortable, and let's dive right into this one. The whole situation began in the late 1980s when Vincent was around 10 years old. His parents owned a restaurant in Thailand at the time, and business was thriving. They weren't super rich by any means, but they were doing much better than most people they knew. Vincent had a great childhood. He lived with his parents in a spacious 3-bedroom apartment. He had his own room, and a third bedroom was set up as a family office and a playroom for all of his toys. Even though his parents worked grueling hours, they had always made sure to take Vincent on an annual vacation. There was always enough money left over to get him the latest game console for Christmas. Looking back, Vincent still smiles when he thinks about those early days growing up. But everything changed one night with a desperate phone call. It was Vincent's Uncle Barry and Auntie Ling. Vincent's dad was Uncle Barry's older brother, but the two men couldn't have been more different. Uncle Barry and Auntie Ling were, to put it bluntly, pretty sketchy and crappy people. They only ever reached out when they needed something. On this particular night, it turns out that their shady import-export business had completely collapsed, leaving them severely in debt to a local loan shark and banks. Fearing for their lives, they begged Vincent's dad to let them stay in the spare bedroom, just until they got back on their feet. Vincent's dad was a man who put family above everything, even above common sense. Despite his wife being adamantly against this idea, she eventually relented, knowing how much her husband wanted to protect his younger brother. Uncle Barry and Auntie Ling moved in the very next night, dragging about 5 large suitcases behind them. The apartment was a comfortable size for 3, but with 5 people now, it suddenly felt way too small. They took over Vincent's playroom. Almost instantly, Vincent's mom regretted her decision. Barry and Ling rarely came out of their room. They didn't look for jobs. Instead, they spent most of their time behind a closed door, loudly arguing over money and blaming each other for their failed business. They only came out for dinner. Vincent's mom was now cooking for 5, but Barry and Ling never once offered to help prep, clean, or pitch in for groceries. They just came out when it was time to eat, and left their dirty plates sitting in the sink when they were done. Vincent's family also had a tradition of eating out every Friday night. Naturally, Auntie Ling and Uncle Barry started tagging along for that too, with Vincent's dad footing the entire bill. Even to 10-year-old Vincent at the time, it was super obvious that they were treating his family like walking ATM machines. The turning point came late one Friday night as they were driving home from dinner. Vincent's dad was behind the wheel, cruising along a desolate, jungle-lined road. It was an area known for sprawling cemeteries and a lack of streetlights. as the car's headlights cut through the heavy darkness. Uncle Barry suddenly shouted from the back seat, demanding his brother to stop the car. Before the vehicle even fully stopped on the narrow shoulder, Barry threw open his door and scrambled down into a muddy, overgrown drainage ditch. When he came back to the car, he was holding something to his chest. It was an old, weather-beaten cookie tin. It was wrapped tight in ripped, yellow Taoist talismans and taped shut with layers of heavy Scotch tape. "What the heck is that thing?" Vincent's dad yelled. "Why are you picking up garbage? Throw it back. You don't even know what's in it." But Uncle Barry's eyes were dilated. He was pretty much shaking with excitement. "Don't worry, brother. I'll clean your car. I'm not throwing this thing back. It has to be valuable." Barry spent the rest of the ride home frantically peeling away the tape to pry the tin box open. When the lid finally popped off, a horrible stench flooded the entire car. It smelled like a mix of stagnant water and a metallic smell. The only person who didn't seem to notice the stench was Uncle Barry. Inside the box, bundled in a filthy rag, was a statue carved from what looked like ivory. It was intricately detailed, but heavily stained with a dark grime. It was the statue of an old man fishing. Uncle Barry held the statue, muttering to himself about finding an antique that could finally wipe his debts clean. He quickly shoved it back in the dirty cloth, forced it back into the tin box, and clutched it under his arm for dear life for the remainder of the ride home. Vincent had no idea how Uncle Barry even spotted the box on that dark road, but he didn't have a good feeling about this. Not long after Barry brought the statue into the apartment, the atmosphere shifted. Uncle Barry took the tin box into his room, and for the next few days, the family assumed he had just pawned it off for a few bucks or something because they never saw it again. But about a week later, a strange odor began popping up throughout the apartment randomly. It was a sharp, metallic tang that reminded Vincent of the smell of blood. Sometimes, when he would get nosebleeds, he could smell the same exact smell. Vincent would catch whiffs of it randomly, but the second he tried to track down the source, the smell would vanish again. Barry and Ling stopped speaking to the family entirely. They stopped coming out for dinner, choosing instead to sneak into the kitchen in the dead of night to boil ramen noodles while everyone else slept. Vincent's mom didn't complain about this though. She was glad she didn't have to cook and clean up after them anymore. One night, Vincent wasn't able to fall asleep, so he crept out to go to the kitchen to find a late-night snack and a glass of water. The lights were off. The orange glow of the street lamps outside bled in through the windows. That's when Vincent saw a dark silhouette. It was Uncle Barry. He was standing rigidly in the darkest corner of the kitchen, facing the wall. His back was arched backwards at an unnatural angle that looked extremely painful. Yet, he just stood there and held this weird position, completely motionless in the dark. Shocked, Vincent froze. After a few long seconds of just staring at his uncle, trying to figure out what the heck he was doing, he finally managed to whisper his uncle's name. "Uncle Barry?" Uncle Barry's head slowly rotated towards him. His lips were pulled back into a grotesque sneer, and his eyes were rolled so far back only the whites were visible. His hands were cramped violently in front of his chest, his fingers curling inward like the legs of a dead spider. Seeing this, Vincent bolted to his parents' room screaming, but by the time his dad rushed out to see what the heck was going on, Uncle Barry was simply standing by the sink in the kitchen, casually drinking a glass of water, looking entirely normal, as if nothing weird had happened at all. Things started to escalate quickly. A week later, Vincent came home from school a little early, and he found droplets of dark blood scattered across the white marble floor in the living room. They led into his uncle's room. His door was cracked open. Vincent held his breath, tiptoed up to the door, and peered inside. He could see Auntie Ling laying flat on the bed, napping. On the floor beside her, Uncle Barry was hunched over the rusted cookie tin. The lid was off. The ivory fisherman statue was out of its rag, standing upright inside the tin box. Vincent noticed that Uncle Barry was chewing on something wet. He watched in absolute horror as his uncle slowly tilted his head back. His mouth and chin were smeared in thick, dark blood. Protruding from his lips were the mangled, half-chewed legs of a raw frog, the kind they sold live at the wet market downstairs. Terrified, Vincent clamped both his hands over his own mouth to stop himself from screaming and hurried back to his own room. He knew his uncle was losing his mind, but he didn't dare tell his parents again. They were stressed enough already with having 2 extra people living in the apartment. And without proof, he knew Uncle Barry would just deny everything like last time. Vincent started staying out as late as he could to escape the oppressive, suffocating energy of the apartment, but soon the nightmare followed him. One Friday evening, Vincent was wandering through a night market with a good friend of his from school. Mid-conversation, his friend suddenly stopped walking. The boy turned to Vincent, his face completely expressionless. When he spoke, the voice that came out wasn't his. It was a raspy, guttural whisper that didn't sound human. "Starving. Starving. Go back, or your cousin dies next." Vincent shoved his friend away in pure terror. The boy immediately snapped out of it, completely confused, no memory of ever saying what he said. Vincent didn't have any cousins, but a very bad feeling started to form in his stomach. When Vincent got back to his apartment later that night, his heart dropped. The apartment was cordoned off with police tape. Uniformed officers were swarming the apartment. His father was sitting on the floor outside their front door, staring vacantly at his own blood-stained hands, completely catatonic. His mom was sitting next to his dad, holding his arm, looking terrified. A police officer gently guided Vincent away from the scene, but he managed to catch one glimpse of the living room. It looked like a slaughterhouse. There was blood everywhere. He would learn the truth later. Uncle Barry had taken the kitchen knife in one hand and the ivory fisherman statue in the other, and he stabbed Aunt Ling in the stomach while she slept. Miraculously, the blade missed her vital organs. She woke up screaming, kicking Barry away, and scrambled out into the living room, bleeding everywhere. That was the exact moment that Vincent's dad and mom walked through the front door as they were coming home from work. Seeing his brother enter, Uncle Barry stopped his pursuit, dropped the knife, bolted past them, and fled. Vincent's parents tried their best to stop the bleeding by holding Auntie Ling's wounds. Luckily, she managed to pull through, but it was later revealed that Aunt Ling was actually pregnant. She had only recently become pregnant not too long ago. Of course, the baby didn't make it, but she was lucky to have survived. It took the authorities about 2 months to locate Uncle Barry. They found his bloated body washed up on the banks of a river. He drowned, but the forensic pathologists found something carved deep into the flesh of Barry's own stomach. A final, desperate message cut into his own skin before the water took him. It read, "I couldn't stop it. I should have never brought that thing home." Auntie Ling survived the physical attack, but the trauma broke her mind. She became a hollow shell of her former self. As for the ivory statue of the fisherman, it wasn't found on Uncle Barry's body, and it wasn't in the apartment. To this day, no one knows where it ended up or who might have picked it up next. So, Hong Kong horror family, what do you think happened here in Vincent's story? Please, pause the video here and let me know what you think in the comments below. Alright, so what do I think happened here from a Chinese cultural perspective? The first thing that I noticed in the story was that the box that Uncle Barry found was deliberately sealed shut and abandoned. In my culture, people don't wrap ordinary objects in yellow Taoist talismans and throw them in a ditch beside cemeteries. If someone goes through the trouble of sealing an object with talismans, tape, and then tossing it in an isolated place, then I think it's safe to assume that this item was abandoned on purpose. Past owners were trying to contain something or get rid of something that had already brought misfortune into their lives. That something can range from an actual spirit or a deeply cursed object. What's interesting is that Uncle Barry somehow noticed this box on a very dark road with little to no streetlights. Vincent himself couldn't understand how his uncle even saw it. We have a belief that ghosts often find people more easily than people find ghosts. The idea is that certain people become spiritually vulnerable because of their state of mind. Uncle Barry wasn't living a peaceful or balanced life. He was terrified of death, desperate to escape his problems, and obsessed with the thought of money, the one thing that could save him. In Buddhism, these kinds of emotions are not just considered unpleasant feelings. They're considered poisons of the mind. Greed, anger, and delusion are called the three poisons because they distort a person's judgment and pull them further into suffering. From this perspective, Uncle Barry wasn't simply unlucky enough to find the object. He may have been the kind of person that the object could attach itself to because of his mental and emotional state. Once Uncle Barry brought this box home, we start seeing changes in him that are very familiar in Chinese ghost stories. He starts isolating himself, stops interacting with his family, he begins staying awake at strange hours, and behaves in increasingly weird ways. He was being slowly enveloped by yin energy. Yin energy isn't evil by itself. Nighttime, stillness, and cemeteries are all considered yin, but excessive yin energy is believed to weaken a person's vitality and affect their mind and emotions. People who are heavily burdened by yin energy are often described as withdrawn, exhausted, irritable, and, in a way, not their usual self. The kitchen incident is especially unsettling because it resembles countless traditional descriptions of spirit attachment. Uncle Barry, standing rigidly in the dark, body bent unnaturally, eyes rolled back, and hands twisted into strange positions, are early signs of possession. It's actually very rare for an entity to fully possess a person overnight, like in the movies. Instead, Buddhism often views these experiences as a kind of entanglement. The person's mind becomes increasingly obsessed, disturbed, and spiritually compromised, and this creates an affinity with certain entities or negative influences. The spirit and the person's own disturbed mind begin feeding off one another. I don't think that Uncle Barry was fully possessed yet at this point, because after Vincent screamed for his dad, Uncle Barry was seen standing there, appearing completely normal. This actually is very similar to many Chinese possession stories, especially those recorded by Buddhist monks and Taoist priests. It's almost like a gradual progression, and very rarely does the possession happen like a switch being flipped, where a spirit suddenly takes over permanently. Instead, the person's behavior becomes increasingly strange. They have periods of clarity, but over time, as the influence grows stronger, things will get worse. We call this process Ling San, meaning being entangled by a yin spirit. The spirit isn't necessarily controlling the person every second of the day. It's more like the person and the spirit are becoming increasingly intertwined. Many Buddhist monks describe the possession progress as swimming and being pulled underwater. At first, the person still has moments where they can come up for air. They still know who they are and can regain control for brief periods. But as time passes, the thing pulling them down becomes stronger and stronger. Eventually, that person won't be able to come up for air anymore. That's when the entity has full control, full possession. I think that the incident in the kitchen was the first real sign that Vincent noticed that something was very wrong. It's not full possession yet, but Uncle Barry definitely showed signs of early to mid-stage possession. There's also a possibility, from a Buddhist point of view, that it may have been one of the first few moments when the entity was manifesting through Uncle Barry. In my culture, a person under spiritual influence may unconsciously adopt the behaviors that reflect the nature of the entity. He could have been beginning to resemble the thing attached to that statue. Uncle Barry was already losing pieces of himself, but there was still enough of himself left inside to occasionally return back to normal. Now, let's talk about the part where Barry was eating the raw frog. In Buddhist cosmology, there's an entire realm known as the Hungry Ghost Realm, or Guaido. Hungry ghosts are beings consumed by insatiable cravings. Their suffering is not merely just physical hunger. It's the torment of never being satisfied, no matter what they consume or possess. They represent greed that has become so extreme that it survives even after death. If we think about it, Uncle Barry's life fits this almost perfectly. Even before finding the statue, he was driven by wanting more money, more help from his brother, more opportunities to escape his debts. The entity even briefly spoke through Vincent's friend and uses the word starving. That word's pretty significant because it points towards a being defined by endless craving and hunger. This kind of thing appears often in Chinese folk belief. There's this concept called borrowing someone's mouth to speak, where a spirit briefly uses another person to deliver a message. Children, in particular, are often considered more spiritually sensitive because they haven't yet developed the same mental barriers and skepticisms as adults. The fact that the friend immediately forgot everything afterwards fits many traditional stories about temporary spirit influence. This entity also made a reference to Vincent's cousin, which was very strange because no one knew yet that Aunt Ling was pregnant. In Buddhist thought, life doesn't begin only at birth. An unborn child is already considered a living being with consciousness. Therefore, the spirit, referring to the unborn child as Vincent's cousin, actually makes a lot of sense within a Buddhist view. So, you might be wondering, how did this entity speak through Vincent's friend? Wasn't it possessing Uncle Barry? This is actually a great question, because in my culture, a spirit doesn't necessarily have to be physically attached to a person to influence them. Spirits are believed to have a kind of a spiritual presence or field of influence, so think of it less as like a person occupying a house and more like a fire spreading heat throughout a room. Even if the spirit was heavily attached to Uncle Barry, it could still affect the environment around them. The spirit also isn't attached to their target 24/7, like many people think, during the early through mid stages of the possession progress. It's not until the very late stages where they're fully attached all the time. What the spirit did through Vincent's friend isn't possession. It's briefly influencing them. We call this 借口傳話 in Cantonese, which literally translates to borrowing a mouth to deliver a message. A good comparison would be like a person making a phone call. Uncle Barry was the spirit's main target, but that doesn't mean it's trapped inside Uncle Barry and unable to reach anyone else. Now, you might be wondering, so what did this entity actually want? What was its main goal? Great question. But this question is also one of the hardest to answer, because it's very hard to say with any certainty what it really wanted, as the motives of spirits are not always clear. I personally think that this entity that latched onto Barry was a hungry and malevolent spirit that wanted blood and suffering. There was the random smell of blood in the apartment, and the spirit used Uncle Barry's body to eat the raw frogs. All of this fits into the hungry ghost realm, where hungry ghosts are believed to be consumed by cravings that are often drawn toward blood, death, and intense emotions. The attack on Aunt Ling and her unborn child were just attempts to satisfy that endless hunger. Now, don't get confused. Hungry ghosts are not usually masterminds carrying out killings. They're usually seen as more pitiful beings trapped by their own cravings and suffering. They're obsessed, addicted, and tormented by desires that can never truly be fulfilled. I don't think it wanted Aunt Ling specifically. Rather, it was most likely just drawn to the whole situation they were in that generated strong emotions, sufferings, and attachments because those conditions resonated with its own state of being. These types of entities usually don't just seek one particular victim, and that's it. They usually try to destroy the person it attaches to, and then spread that suffering outward to everyone around them. Auntie Ling wasn't a target because this entity hated her specifically. She was simply there, the person closest to Uncle Barry. The entity wanted her to be a casualty to help with the collapse of Uncle Barry's mind and spirit. The true target has always been Barry himself. Ultimately, I don't think the lesson of the story is simply never pick up cursed objects. The deeper lesson here is about the state of the human mind. Now, I want to talk about something else. Why was the spirit inside that statue to begin with? How did it get there? So, I think there's two possibilities here. The first is that this statue of the fisherman once belonged to someone who died with intense attachment to it. It could have been their prized possession. The other possibility is that someone performed the rituals involving the statue. In Southeast Asia, there are many traditions involving spirit-infused items like amulets or statues. This is considered a form of black magic. Now, given the fact that Uncle Barry found it wrapped up and sealed in a tin, covered in Taoist talismans, I strongly believe that whoever had this before Barry knew exactly what they were dealing with here. Yellow Taoist talismans are a huge giveaway because they're often used to suppress, imprison, and contain whatever it was inside that statue. Sometimes, there are certain objects that people fear where it would be more dangerous to destroy them improperly than to simply toss them, where it would be more dangerous for them to destroy it improperly than it is for them to simply toss it. The safest thing to do would be to seal it away and abandon it somewhere remote, hoping that no one would find it. So what's the best way to protect yourself from something like what Uncle Barry went through? We have a very famous saying, and it goes, "Mok tam siu pin yi." This translates to, "Don't be greedy for small gains." In many supernatural stories across Asia, oftentimes, everything starts after someone finds something abandoned and thinks, maybe this is valuable. Maybe I found a treasure. So, if you ever come across an object that looks intentionally abandoned, my best advice is not to touch it. Don't bring it home with you. Just leave it alone. Don't kick it or move it. Don't touch it. It's not that we think every abandoned object contains a spirit. Of course, most do not. But culturally, there's a belief that some things are abandoned for a reason. So it's always just safer to not interfere. The other thing is that in many Buddhist teachings, beings from lower realms are believed to resonate with certain mental states, especially extremes, So, extreme greed, obsession, addiction, etc. Whenever a person is consumed by these emotions over a long period of time, they become spiritually and mentally imbalanced. Take Uncle Barry as an example. His mental state was already very similar to a hungry ghost's mind long before he ever picked up that statue. Cultivating a calm, compassionate, and ethical life is itself a form of protection. A balanced mind is considered much less susceptible to negative influences. Oh, and some of you might be wondering, what are beings of lower realms? These are forms of existence that are considered more painful, confused, or spiritually obscured than the human realm. The three higher realms are generally considered the human realm, the heavenly realm, and Azora realm. The lower realms are the animal realm, the hungry ghost realm, and the underworld realm. This concept is a whole rabbit hole in itself, so I can go into more detail on this in future episodes if anyone's interested. Now, if you do happen to bring an object home that's leading to persistent nightmares, oppressive feelings, unexplained disturbances, or sudden atmosphere changes at home, then the first thing I would suggest is to stop interacting with the object. Don't challenge it, or start performing random rituals you found on the internet. People sometimes make situations worse because they panic and begin experimenting. Now, yes, you should get rid of the object if you did happen to bring something cursed home. You don't want to keep it, but it's also important to note that you shouldn't just throw it away carelessly, and don't burn it carelessly. Throwing it away in the trash will just allow someone else to pick it up afterwards, like in Uncle Barry's situation. And burning it without knowing what you're dealing with is also discouraged because, depending on what it is, it can aggravate whatever is attached to that object, or even improperly release it. The safest thing to do is to bring it with you to see a Buddhist monk, a Taoist priest, or maybe a church, depending on whatever religion you follow. Having the item will help the specialist determine what it is you actually brought home with you, and they'll have an easier time helping you. Thank you, Hong Kong Horror family, for making it all the way to the end of this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed this one. Until we speak again next week, stay safe and good night.